Good evening. Welcome, everyone. We have a few more chairs making the way over from the other side, so everyone will have a comfortable place to sit in a moment. Welcome to our important event discussion entitled Outsmarting Antisemitism. Of course, this event is in memory of David Farahi and Peter Topol, as well as in honor of the yahrzeit, the passing of the Rabbi, which was yesterday. And Jerry's father as well. Our discussion tonight, of course, is a very painful topic. You don't have to look very far. You don't have to look too deeply to see that, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is as popular as it's been in a very long time. On college campuses, to Reddit threads, and around the world, anti-Semitism is once again rearing its ugly head. And this time around, it's especially prevalent as it shows up as anti-Israel anti-Semitism. It's so prominent that you might think that 70, 80 years ago, before the state of Israel was founded, what do they even hate us for? Right? They hate us for the state of Israel. What do they hate us for before? But obviously, the modern version of anti-Semitism, the modern phenomena of anti-Israel hate, is just the latest version of what Dr. Jonathan Sachs calls a mutating virus. As he explains, anti-Semitism is not a single ideology. It's a hatred. The problem is that your average civilized person has a problem hating someone random. And throughout history, people have mutated this hatred to hate the Jews because they were against whatever was popular at that time. And throughout history, this has been expressed in many different ways. In the early Common Era to the Middle Ages, that showed up as anti-religious hatred. Whatever religion the hater was from, be it Christianity, be it Islam, be it something else, they hated the Jews because they were heretics. They were involved in trying to subvert their religion. And so thousands of years ago, that was the most prevalent form of anti-Semitism, the anti-religious, that the Jews were against religion. As the centuries continued, as the world became more enlightened and religion was no longer the center of most people's world, it suddenly became the science. The Jews were against science, or scientifically, Jews were worse, right? If I'm all in for science and my textbook tells me that the Jews are bad and the Jews are hurting me and the Jews are inferior, it's suddenly so easy to hate them. Since World War II, since the end of the Holocaust, the world has become more and more focused and more worried about human rights and avoiding the atrocities that have happened. So in the modern era, in the late 20th century until today, that has become the idea of that the Jewish people are against human rights. This isn't a new phenomenon. This is just the old hatred dressing up in new clothing to match whatever's in vogue, whatever's popular, and whatever will garner the most sympathy for their cause. Now, when we talk about anti-Israel sentiment, when we talk about anti-Israel hatred, the number one response that any person will tell you is, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm anti-Zionist. I'm just criticizing the Israeli government. And on the surface, this might seem like a pretty rational thing to say. I mean, we can call for a raise of hand. Who doesn't have a problem with the modern state of Israel? I mean, personally, I think Tel Aviv airport is too far from Jerusalem and the train is really annoying. Was that criticism anti-Semitic? Last time I was there, the shawarma guy gave me too few pickles. Again, is that anti-Semitism? How can we differentiate between what's proper, the criticism, and the protests that happen in Israel criticizing the government for one policy or another? Are those by definition anti-Semitic? Of course not. And so the question becomes, how do we differentiate? How can we recognize? And how can we separate legitimate criticism and criticism that is actually just anti-Semitism in disguise? And so the famous refusenik, Natan Sharansky, gave his famous 3D test. He said, if you want to know if your criticism is legitimate, or more likely, if you're arguing with someone and they're just claiming that it's just criticism, it's not personal, it's not anti-Semitic, you can check that their criticism against these three Ds, these three concepts. First of all, does their criticism involve demonization? If they're suddenly comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, or Gaza to a concentration camp, or the treatment of Arab Israelis to apartheid, that is clearly not a legitimate discussion, because they're demonizing and they're completely distorting the facts in order to paint an extremely negative, extremely dangerous picture. In the modern day, since October 7th, the word that's being thrown around is genocide. Calling it a genocide without historical, without legal, without factual backing is 100% demonizing the government of Israel, demonizing the brave soldiers of Israel, and therefore cannot be disguised and cannot be hidden behind just criticism. Another great test is to test whether or not there's a double standard. Throughout the history of the UN, there hasn't been a single government criticized as often and as severely as Israel. You might think that the whole world is at peace and everyone's happy and singing around their bonfire, but that's obviously not the case. And so when we look at whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the protesters on campus, and we ask them, you seem to think that you have legitimate concern about Israel. Why didn't you speak up when those same concerns came up against other countries? And as much as they'll try to argue and fight back and say Israel is different, when you really get down to the core of it, it's just because they have a problem with the Jews. The modern term that's the modern protests are all about how it's American bombs, and therefore they have something against Israel. Well, when Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen, it was also American-made bombs, and no one seemed to bat an eyelash. And throughout this discussion, throughout the history of the state of Israel, there has always been this double standard that Israel is judged more harshly and judged for things that other countries get away with, which should cause the criticizer to take a good look in the mirror and say, what is it about the state of Israel? What is it about the Jewish people that I'm so affected by that I come out and criticize? And the answer is anti-Semitism. And finally, the final D, the final test, is, does the argument boil down to delegitimization? Do the people criticizing Israel believe in Israel's right to exist, in the Jewish people's right to exist? And this can happen with criticism against within the state of Israel, about the state of Israel, or to any Jew. If someone does not recognize Israel's right to exist, or a Jewish person's right to exist within a neighborhood, within a community, within a faculty, that is anti-Semitism. There's a great story that really encompasses these three ideas, that in the 1950s, the president of Harvard was trying to put a cap on the amount of Jewish people that can enroll. And when one of his colleagues asked him about, how can you do that? The Jewish people are, how can you openly hate the Jewish people? He said, it's not about that. The Jewish people cheat, and we can't have them in our university. So his colleague said, I'm sorry to inform you this, but this is academia. Everyone cheats, everyone skirts, everyone tries to get around. And so the president of Harvard said, excuse me, don't change the subject. Right now we're talking about the Jews. And so obviously what can be seen and can be tried to be hidden as legitimate criticism, when we tear down, and especially when we look at it within these three ideas, it quickly falls apart and we quickly see what it is. These three ideas were included in the Holocaust museums, in the modern day definition of anti-Semitism, which was just passed here in Nevada as it's firmly recognized. And that is the criteria set forth are based on these three principles, and what they show is truly behind the hatred. What's especially painful about the modern day version of anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel sentiment, the anti-Israel protests, the anti-Israel organizations, is that it's suddenly so much worse because it's not just coming from the outside, but suddenly it's coming from the inside as well. And there are so many Jewish people, Jewish students joining in the protest. And when Jews join the causes, when Jews join forces with hate, not only are they on the wrong side of the issue, but it gives the other side, it gives the haters, it gives the anti-Semites legitimacy. The token Jewish friend. Look, how can we be anti-Semitic? Half of our encampment are Jews. We even have a Seder, of course, with non-Israeli made matzah, but we even have a Seder during our encampment. And so it's so painful with this modern form of anti-Semitism, how it suddenly becomes in vogue for Jewish people to join. In order to understand, how is it possible How can it be that our own children, our own brothers and sisters, our fellow Jews are joining in on the other side? We can look back at our history and see that this pattern has existed throughout the history of anti-Semitism. Because broadly speaking, every story in history, every anti-Semitic event, every anti-Semitic story can be put into one of two boxes. And we'll call them the Purim anti-Semitism and the Hanukkah anti-Semitism. And to explain what that means, we'll go quickly through the story of Purim. The story of Purim, as told in the book of Esther, was in the time of Achashverosh. Haman, the wicked descendant of Amalek, the sworn enemy of the Jewish people, hated the Jews. And so he approached Achashverosh and he told him, who was the ruler of pretty much this whole civilized world at that time, and he said, I would like to kill the Jewish people, exterminate them, men, women, and children, and one day wipe them out. And Achashverosh went along with it. And that was the decree for a few months that the Jewish people were to be exterminated. Obviously, as the story ended, God performed miracles, and Mordechai and Esther were at the right place at the right time to thwart the decree, to show, to reveal, to uncover and display his hatred. And Achashverosh changed his mind, and the Jewish people were allowed to defend themselves, and they were saved. And that's the story of Purim, the story of an anti-Semite that sought to destroy the Jewish people, men, women, and children. Didn't care what they were doing, didn't care how religious they were. It was all about destroying the Jewish people, extermination. On the other hand, the story of Hanukkah is much more complex. The story of Hanukkah involves the Jewish people during the time of the Assyrian Greek Empire. They were in charge of the Holy Land. And some Jewish people decided that they would like to become more like the Greek culture around them. And that sparked a split within the Jewish communities. The split of those who wanted to modernize, who wanted to go with the next cool thing and join the culture around them, and those Jews who wanted to stay true to the Torah and stay true to the tradition. Unfortunately, that inner family dispute spiraled out of control, and eventually the Greek armies became involved. And when they did, they took over the temple, turned it into a pagan idol worship house, and the story of Hanukkah continues. The difference between Hanukkah and Purim is that during the time of Purim, not one single Jew would have even considered flipping sides. Nobody would have thought to go join Haman and his armies. They were out to exterminate every Jewish person. However, during the time of Hanukkah, the story was started by Jews. This form of anti-Semitism, of not hating Jews or claiming not to hate Jews for who they are, but for what they are, for what they represent, for what they do, is so much more dangerous. Because that allows there to be that little voice, that little entrance that maybe it's okay for Jewish people to join as well. I don't hate myself. I don't hate the Jewish people. I just think it's time for us to modernize. And so when we look at the difference between the Purim anti-Semitism, which is just about destroying the Jewish people, and the story in Hanukkah anti-Semitism, which is about eradicating the specific beliefs and practices of the Jewish people, we can see why it's so much easier for Jewish people to join the Hanukkah anti-Semitism. First of all, they don't have to renounce Judaism. As mentioned, they can have a Seder in the encampment because it's supposedly not about being Jewish. It's not about Judaism. It's about this one issue that I want to criticize. In fact, many of them believe that they are saving Judaism. They're modernizing it. They're cutting out the one part of Judaism that's really bad. Right? They view support for the state of Israel, support for the residents of Israel as this really bad cancer that has to be cut out, and then Judaism will be good and great and modern and ready for the 21st century. And so in their mind, not only are they, it's okay, it's a proper thing to do. If you love Jewish people, if you love Jews, you have to support the eradication of this part of Judaism. And finally, it allows them to fit in with the world around them. They're sophisticated, they're proper, they're at the top of the world in their field because of their support. And of course, the Hanukkah anti-Semitism, these days, we can call it what it is, which is Israel anti-Semitism. This split was fascinatingly seen during the 20th century, because during the 20th century, there were these two forces of anti-Semitism that were going on in Europe. There was, of course, Nazi Germany, and there was the Soviet regime as well. And you can really see how by just couching their anti-Semitism in a slightly better way, and by saying the right words, the Soviet regime was able to bring on Jew after Jew. And not only that, they had an entire desk, an entire bureau that was the Jewish desk. It was about these ideas that we're not here to eradicate Judaism. Jews are great. We'll let the old rabbis sit in the synagogue, they could do their thing. But it can't continue. You have to modernize, you have to be part of the new society, and you have to be ready to expel anything that drags Judaism down. Of course, Nazi Germany didn't have that. There was no Jewish desk, there was no Jews involved in the regime, because when it's perm anti-Semitism, it's so much easier to spot and to avoid. The problem is when we have Israeli, Hanukkah, Soviet anti-Semitism, when they can dress it up and pretend and try to trick everyone into thinking it's not really anti-Semitism. I'm here to save the Jewish people. I'm here to upgrade, to update, to freshen everything up. And that is especially painful. So what do we do about it? What can we do when we see our fellow Jews taken the wrong way and involved in these horrible protests and completely seeming to miss the point of what it means to be Jewish and how to protect ourselves? So the first thing many people will try to do is, well, let's debate. Let's talk about what the Jewish claim. What is the Jewish claim to the land of Israel? If we debate them, if we convince them, if we can just have that one more argument, that they'll be convinced and suddenly they'll stop hating us and they'll stop hating themselves. That's what we like to think. And so the common arguments, the common debates, if you ever make the mistake of going on Twitter or on the internet and you start seeing what people are arguing back and forth, what are the most common phrases about why do the Jewish people have a right to live in the land of Israel? Well, first of all, there's international law. The United Nations voted us in. The English gave it to us. The world voted. It's ours by right. Another common argument is that the land of Israel and inhabiting the land of Israel is vital for Jewish survival. After the Holocaust, we realized that we need to have a homeland. We need to have our own armies. We need to have our own sovereignty. We need to have our own determination. And the state of Israel and living in Israel is vital for that end. Yes. And finally, there is the argument that historically, dig anywhere in Israel and you'll find shards of Jewish things. You'll find shekels from the time of the Holy Temple. How can anyone deny our right to live in Israel if historically it's been our homeland? These are the three arguments that we like to give, that we like to argue, that these are our talking points when it comes to defending the Jewish people's right to live in Israel. And they're all true. And they're all valid. The problem is that they cannot be the be-all and end-all of our argument. Because all of these ideas, all of these concepts grant the premise that we need to prove why we have a right to the land of Israel. Once the discussion has started, once we're already debating whether or not we can live there, whether or not we have a right, all of these arguments can be debated. And there are some pretty strong counterpoints to each of these arguments. You tell me that there's international law? Well then, if the United Nations voted you into existence, can they vote you out of existence? If your entire claim to being in the land of Israel is that the United Nations gave it to you, the British gave it to you, well, who are they to give it to you? Let's go back to colonialism. Let's go back and see who had a right to give it to the Jewish people. And once you're giving yourself into that debate, that can continue to be debated long after it should have been settled. Jewish survival. It's true. The Jewish people need a homeland, a right to self-determination, their own armies, their own abilities. But why does it have to happen in the Middle East? You couldn't choose a better place to set up your homeland? As the famous joke goes, that when God was creating the world and he's created the land of Israel, he's describing to the angels this beautiful land, this amazing land, this blessed land, this holy land. And the angel said, maybe it's not so fair, spread the wealth around a little bit. Why does this one piece of land deserve all of the blessings? So God said, just wait till you see the neighbors I'm giving them. It'll all make sense. Why? If it's just about the technical right to survival, well, first of all, Our right to survival maybe shouldn't overpower the people who were living there before. Maybe our right to survival shouldn't override the countries around who hate us. Maybe we should have set up in Alaska and Madagascar and Uganda, which were all viable options for a Jewish homeland. The country, there was actually no one living there. They were happy to give it to us. Why do we need to, if it's just about the Jewish right to survival, it could have been anywhere, not necessarily in the Middle East. And finally, when you talk about history, the very quick answer of the fact that we have a right to live there because it's always been our homeland. All right, people move around. If you dig in Italy, you'll find Greek artifacts, and if you dig in Egypt, you'll find Greek artifacts and you'll find Roman artifacts. The whole world has been shuffled so many times. The fact that your ancestors happened to live there a couple thousand years ago doesn't give you the right to move back in. You were kicked out. You moved on. History continues to roll, and whoever lives there now is the rightful owner. You don't have a right to move back in just because it was once upon a time your home. And so all three of these points, well, technically valid. When you start to debate them, when you start to argue, if this is the be-all and end-all of your argument, then you've already granted the premise, you've already ceded the point that the Jewish people have to earn or have to prove their right to the land of Israel. This concept of that, once you're debating, the children or the college students can debate back, is very painfully expressed in an essay written by an author who writes, "I'm Jewish, I fight anti-Semitism, and I support Palestinian rights." And she describes how she grew up in a home that was pro-Zionist, and she went to all the right camps, and she learned all the right songs. But when it came to her doing her own research, one thing struck out at her. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s, after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes. And so if it's just about the fact that the British gave it, well, I'm against British colonialism. The British had no right to be there, and therefore the Jews have no right to be there. Once we grant that premise that the Jewish people have to prove their right to live in Israel, it's up for debate. And the college students and the children of the next generation can disagree and they can argue. And the unfortunate, painful reality is that this is really hard to overcome with someone who's already cemented their position. And as much as we like to talk and argue and inspire, unfortunately, for some of them, it's too far, because their basis, their bedrock of connection to the land of Israel is a logical debate. And they went the other way. They were convinced by the other side. What is the correct answer? What is the correct solution? Is, of course, a proper Jewish education. And while it may be, I don't want to use the words too late. It's never too late. That we can always try and we can always inspire. But unfortunately, for many people, it might just be too late. But we can look to the next generation. We can make sure that this doesn't happen again. That the next generation that is being educated now have their priorities in order. And they are ready to respond to the question, what is the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel? That God gave it to us. Yes, after that, these amazing things happen, and historically and legally and practically, we have a right as well. But that is not the foundation. The foundation has to be Jewish education. That if we can nurture that soul and we can inspire them, and for when they're little, we can teach them about the fact that God gave the land to Abraham. He promised it to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and to their children. And the entire time the Jewish people were traveling in the desert, it was with one goal: to inherit this land which was rightfully theirs. The Torah itself starts off with the creation of the world. The Torah is not a history book. The Torah is not here to tell us the order that things happened in. In fact, many times the Torah is out of order. And many events in history, the Torah glosses over completely. Why did the Torah feel it's so necessary to tell us about the creation of the world? Because, as Rashi, the commentary on the Torah, tells us right away, there's going to become a day when people will question the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel. And they'll say, you guys are thieves, you stole this land. And our response has to start with pointing at the beginning of Genesis, the beginning of Bereshit, and saying, God created the world, and therefore it's up to him to give it to whoever he wants. And when a Jewish child is educated with that love of Torah, with that respect, and with that connection to Torah, and we use that as the building blocks, that from there we can teach and we can learn and we can understand their connection to the land of Israel is through the Torah, then suddenly these arguments, these logical fallacies, one way or the other, don't really matter. Because through Jewish education, we can turn one view into the correct perspective on Torah. And as mentioned, as when the world created, when the Torah starts in the beginning, God created the heavens and the world and the earth. That is, that He chose to give a piece of the world, Israel, to us, as God told to Abraham. And this gift is eternal. And so with Jewish education, the foundation must be that Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful. And when that is the foundation, and upon that, we teach about Israel, we teach about the beauty and the connection and the history and the heritage that we have with the land of Israel, that will lead, God willing, to the inevitability of less anti-Israel activity. And the most important part is when they're approached on campus, or they're approached by their friends, or someone wants to start up a debate, all they have to do is say, Israel is ours because God gave it to us. Now, what is the person going to respond? Well, I don't believe in the Torah. I don't care about that. And a Jewish child who's raised properly can answer to that. That sounds like a you problem. You don't believe in the Torah. You don't believe in my right. I don't care about that. That's your problem. I know, and I firmly believe that Israel is my heritage. Israel is my right. And there's nothing you can say and argue and debate that will convince me otherwise. Because it's not about the logical or historical or practical or legal connection that we have with the land of Israel. It's the religious and eternal God-given connection that we have through the Torah that God has given us. Now, of course, that's great to answer to a friend that you might meet or someone who doesn't really debate. We can eagerly and easily ignore them and go on living as proud Jews. The problem becomes when these anti-Semites, suddenly they have some teeth. Maybe they're elected to a position, maybe they're appointed to a position, maybe they win a primary for a mayor in a major city, and suddenly we're starting to debate and worry, what can I answer? How do I deal with the seeming anti-Semite who's out to get me? And I can't just ignore them. They're in a position of power. They can decide the fate. They can change the reality. They can change support for Israel. They have actual consequences to their opinions. The Rebbe's answer and the Rebbe's approach to dealing with such an anti-Semite, someone who you have to deal with, there's no choice, there's no way around it. The Rebbe had a fascinating, and I'll dare say controversial viewpoint on how to deal with them. And the Rebbe based his view on one of the first times that one of our forefathers encountered or was coming up against an anti-Semite. I'm talking, of course, of the story of Jacob returning from the house of Lavan. He's established a family, he has wealth, he has bearings, and he's heading back to home. He's heading back towards the house of his father. Along the way, he gets news that his brother is coming against him with an army, with a militia. His brother's out for revenge. His brother's out to kill him. What did Jacob do? The Torah tells us Jacob took a three-pronged approach. Three methods that he took on simultaneously in order to greet the threat. Number one, most importantly, was prayer. He prayed to God that whatever method should end up being successful, he should be saved. Because ultimately, our salvation and our help, no matter how we deal with it naturally, it all goes back to God, and God will protect us no matter who's in power, and no matter what the reality around the world is, God will protect us. The second thing that he did was that he sent gifts. He sent flocks of sheep and goats and bulls to Esav as an appeasement, as a gift, as a tribute to Esav. Finally, he prepared for war. If the diplomacy should fail, he was ready to fight. He was ready to defend himself. Nachmanides, one of the commentaries on the Torah, says that these three prongs are vital whenever we are faced with anti-Semitism. And he says, throughout history, when the Jewish people have been faced with a threat, whether it was the Roman Empire, whether it was the Christians, the Christian governments, no matter who was oppressing the Jewish people, the rabbis at the time looked back to Jacob as the inspiration for how they should act. And the famous story that there was during this event that we just mentioned with Jacob meeting his brother, what ended up happening? In the end, Esav accepted the presents. And he was appeased and he calmed down and he let Jacob pass unharmed. Now, the rabbis debate whether this was part-time. Was this a change in Esav? Was he legitimately changed, or was he just, mollified for the moment? But they all agree that at the time it worked. It let the Jewish people continue unhurt for another generation. And because of that, throughout history, when the Jewish people have been faced with an existential threat, the first thing they always tried to do was diplomacy. Some of the great sages of the Talmud, who would go on to say some horrific things about the Roman government and criticize them vocally, they put their differences aside when it came to saving Jewish lives. Because to protest and to argue would just rile them up more. And they appreciated their position that unfortunately they had to mollify the government in power, and they had to try by natural methods to save themselves. Of course, it didn't always work. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the effort was always there. That was always step one. Now we might be thinking, well, that was great back then. That was their only position. That was their only out. Here we live in America. We have the ability to protest. We have the ability to voice our opinion. We have the ability to make our displeasure known. Why shouldn't we do that? And to that, the simple answer is, what outcome are you expecting? If we protest, or in the modern vernacular, if we cancel someone for being an anti-Semite, what did we really accomplish? We exercised our right to protest. We exercised our natural need to express ourselves and to express our displeasure. But at the end of the day, the other person is not going to change your mind because of it. The other person is not going to back down now that they've been challenged and pigeonholed as an anti-Semite. That's the only place that they're going to live. And the Rebbe, stemming from the Rebbe's incredible ability to see the complexity in every human, to realize that while we can only see the surface and we can only see the hatred, we can only see the outer layer, the Rebbe recognized that in every person, there's complexity. In every person, there's nuance. And what one person might be coming off as extremely anti-Semitic and extremely harmful to the state of Israel, if we can dig a little deeper, if we can access them, if we can talk to them human to human, maybe we can spin them the other way. Maybe we can have an effect on them. And the biggest way that the Rebbe would tell people to practice this was to show them who you are as a person. There's a joke about the anti-Semite and the Jew and the Jew. What's the difference? If you ask an anti-Semite, what do you think of the Jewish people? They're horrible, they're parasites, they're in control, they're communists, they're capitalists, all the horrible things about the Jewish people. What about your neighbor, the Jewish guy? Oh, him. He's great. He always mows his lawns. He rolls up his garbage. He's a wonderful guy. If you ask a Jewish person, what do you think about the Jewish nation? Oh, everyone's amazing and beautiful. And we all love God. And we're all God's children. One big happy family. What about the guy that's sitting next to you in show? What do you think about him? Oh, him. He's a mamzer. I hate him. I can't stand him. But if we look at that first half, and if we have the ability to approach them on a human level, yes, they're hateful. Yes, they said some horrible things. But is that all that there is to them? Is there maybe some complexity? Is there maybe a deeper level that we're not aware of, that they might not even be aware of, that at the very least we can tap into that and hopefully use that to our advantage and to, if maybe not change their mind, but change their behavior. And slowly but surely we can bring out the good in them. Now, of course, there are limits to this. And we're not talking about approaching an active, hostile enemy who's out to kill us and approach them with love. But we're talking about a more nuanced situation. When there is room to negotiate, where there is room for diplomacy, where there is room to change minds and hearts. We have to try that first, as has been proven time and time again through history. And especially in the following video, we'll see 2 clips of where that has happened within the last few decades as well.
After the Six-Day War in 1967, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, decided to stop selling arms to the countries which had been involved in the conflict. Now, really, this move was against Israel, because the Arab countries were being supplied by Russia. In 1970, France suddenly announced that they'd be selling 110 Mirage fighter jets to Libya. Now, there was an outcry amongst many American Jews that this was a major threat to Israel and was anti-Semitic. So when de Gaulle's successor, President Pompidou, visited the United States, there were a series of very forceful demonstrations organized by Jews in Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. Now, this is a few months later.
Wenn der Präsident von Frankreich hat den Mann getan, Afghanistan und Chulu, gerechnet an Frankreich, wird sich erschrecken, wo sie gewonnen, auf morgen, Israel kommen sich schon erzählen, sie gewinnen den Embargo. Afal Piquet hat verkauft, klein Neschek, aber dann die, was einen noch abpissen. Kleininke. Danach, als sie gewonnen, dort der Afghanistan, hat nicht gelassen, dass ich verkauft. Danach, als sie durchgegangen, am Meschechs Mann hat aufgehört Siedler, hat weiter angeheben mit dem Tombach Aschori, hat Reis genommen 300 Tiden von Eretz Mitzrayim. Und keine Afghanis, und kein Pirsum, und keine Unionen. Und hat dann gesagt, die Zeitungen sollen wegen der Ruf nicht schreiben. Mit der Wissig wegen der Ruf von der Goyische Zeitungen. Für was? Dass ich ein Koche, der einzige Weg, was mir kommt, Peil, Bassin Israel. Du Ruf, was mir kommt zu sehen, ist zu gehen, jeder Tag und mich schreit, Herr Zechain, du bist der Sonne Israel. Herr Zechain, du bist der Gazlen mit einer Zeich und Chulu. Nur man redet mit dem auf einem diplomatischen Weg. Jener weiß, sei was mit Tracht wegen ihm, aber Vorteil benodem und 40 wer benodem 40. Woher ich komme, das, was mit tut, Bachscheu von der kommunistischen Medine. Vor einer Reis, Miedisch, Joschavu, Beschavu, von dort in der Fall, was eine Macht nicht in Afghanistan ist, und die, was sie seine Mag in der Afghanistan gegen Russland, da sehr allein angesagt. Aber wir sollten mit Farsim sein, von der Medine führt man eine Reis. Bescheid haben gesehen, dass Pompidou hat abgestellt, verkäufende Klenesche, ist geworden, Afghanistan gegen Pompidou, hat zurückgegeben, verkäufende Klenesche Ktanim, und hat genommen 300 Tiden von Frankreich.
Pompidou was so angered by the violent protests that they caused a major diplomatic flare-up, and his whole trip to the U.S. almost ended in disaster. President Nixon had to fly down to New York especially to calm him down. In a talk in 1970 on a Shabbos, obviously not recorded on tape, the Rebbe says that he asked somebody about a similar situation. Why are you running around and crying anti-Semitism when you see it's simply not effective in changing anything? And the fellow replied, I figured it out 10 years ago, that this is the way to operate, and I don't have time to rethink it. Stop telling me what to do. And the Rebbe adds that these very vocal efforts might only succeed to attract attention to the individuals or organizations leading those efforts, rather than affecting any real change. A note I'd like to share. In this whole piece, we're only referring to a certain type of anti-Semitism. For example, the Rebbe had a very vocal and robust approach to Israel and how it must defend itself by any and all means, without apology, and how Israel must be so strong militarily that her enemies are afraid to attack. Now, these issues are for a different program. The next anecdote I'd like to share is about a letter written to the Rebbe by Professor Alan Dershowitz.
When I was involved in politics and civil rights and human rights, the enemy of civil rights and civil liberties was Jesse Helms, the United States Senator from North Carolina. He stood against everything that I stood for, and many of my friends and colleagues stood for, and so I was a little surprised, disappointed, when Jesse Helms was honored by the Rebbe in Chabad. And so I wrote a very polite letter to the Rebbe, who I had met previously a number of times, respectfully wondering why they chose to honor a man who was against integration, was against gay rights, women's rights, equality for all. And the Rebbe wrote back a very poignant, very powerful letter saying, we honor not only to recognize the past, but to influence the future, and watch carefully to see whether or not we have had an influence on the conduct of Jesse Helms.
The Rebbe actually wrote a 3.5-page letter explaining to Professor Dershowitz that, first of all, Senator Helms was not an honoree, but he came to an event at the Capitol, along with other senators and congressmen, in order to pay tribute to a Jew and a Jewish movement. The Rebbe writes that he's long been concerned about the state of our nation's public schools and the American family and society, and the event was geared to upgrading the ethical and moral foundations of education. It's really a fascinating letter. We'll get it up online and put a link in the first comment. After a full 2 pages, the Rebbe signs off, and then there's a 1.5-page PS. I'll quote a few sentences. The Rebbe is writing to Professor Dershowitz. I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there's a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. And the Rebbe gives several examples, and he continues. My experience with such people has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperative. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite, however tempting it is to do so. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any.
And sure enough, very shortly after he was honored, he assumed a very influential role in the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee and became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and strongest supporters of the nation state of the Jewish people and of other Jewish causes as well. And obviously the Rebbe had an enormous influence on persuading Jesse Helms that even with his very conservative values, he could become a beacon for the Jewish state.
And so in summary, when we talk about our approach when faced with anti-Semitism, what can we do, especially with the painful reality of our own children, of our own college students, of our own next generation being pulled into it? We have to realize where it's coming from, what it represents, and what can change it. And we have to realize that especially while dealing with our own brothers and sisters in the Jewish people, our response to anti-Semitism cannot be a logical back and forth hoping to convince them or hoping to inspire them with the short or long history of the Jewish people in the land. It has to go back all the way to the fact that God gave the land to Abraham. In a letter, President Shazar wrote to the Rebbe. He questioned or criticized slightly the Rebbe for the fact that the Rebbe never used the phrase, the state of Israel. The Rebbe would always call it the land of Israel. And he asked why the Rebbe did that. In response, the Rebbe wrote that by referring it to the state of Israel, you're saying that the connection and the right to live there goes back to 1948. By calling it the land of Israel, you're connecting it back to the land that God gave Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, otherwise known as Yisrael. And that has to be our bedrock as well. If we want to change the next generation, if we want to inspire them to have a close connection, to have a relationship with the land that goes deeper than some logical discussion, it has to start with an appreciation and a connection to the Torah itself, to God himself, and through that, to the land as well. Of course, when dealing with external anti-Semitism, we need to make a hard choice. Sometimes the most effective solution is just to ignore it, to stand tall, to be proud Jews, and not to care so much about what other people think of us. And when it does come to it, when there is a mind that has to be changed, when there is something that has to be accomplished, to sit down and think about what is the most effective way, what will actually change minds and hearts. Is it more effective to cancel someone, to call them out, to pigeonhole them in their hatred, or to work with them, to find the complexities, to find the nuances within their opinions, within their personalities, and work with them to bring out the best version of who they are. And God willing, this will continue until we no longer have to deal with anti-Semitism with the coming of Mashiach, may be very, very soon.